I'm James Gray. It's Monday night. I've got George and Calvin with me, which can only mean one thing. It's Tennis Unfiltered.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Yes, welcome back to the tennis podcast where we don't hold back. I'm James Gray of the iNewspaper and iNews.co.uk, and if you're new around here, as I understand a fair few of you are, then it's time to meet the rest of the team since we are all back together for the first time in a while. Firstly, this man is George Bellshaw, the tennis writer, broadcaster, and prolific amateur doubles trier, my notes say. George, how the hell are you?
I'm not very well, James, to be perfectly honest. I apologise in advance if I start spluttering. I've got my finger hovering over the mute button to try and limit it as much as possible. But I've been off work a little bit last week with what I'm calling the super flu, and it's super because I was also vomiting as well. So it's
that's a level of detail that I bet all our new listeners are turning off at. But you know what?
Yeah, you'll get to like me, I promise. But yeah, maybe not this week.
He grows on you like a tumour. And our representative from the north is Calvin Betton, the esteemed tennis coach. And, much to my surprise, I'd say surprise, it's no personal slight, but Calvin, I did not expect you to be our sort of resident culinary expert either, but you're attempting something quite ambitious this evening, I believe.
I am, yeah. I bought a new smoker about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I'm currently cooking a brisket and a pork belly in it. It's been going about 6 hours as we speak, with about another two to go, I think.
2 more hours. So Calvin may be in and out this evening because he's got to keep an eye on a brisket, as the bishop said to the actress. We've got loads to get, George.
I was going to say, if I was in the same room as Calvin's smoker, I think that could be the end of my lungs. That might
do it
be
outside.
Or nail in my coffin.
You don't smoke it inside.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. But if it was indoors and it wasn't here, then I would be on death's door, I think.
Yeah, I've absolutely no doubt about that, George. Well, you sound very healthy, I have to say. You have definitely sounded croakier, despite your... maybe you've made a special effort to look after your voice, in particular
it'll dip
for tonight.
The second half of the podcast, you'll see how bad it gets.
I've no doubt. George is now sipping some sort of unction that is going to do its best to revive him as the day goes on. As I say, we've got loads to talk about. It's been a pretty dreadful week for British tennis. We'll talk about Emma Raducanu losing to Bianca Andreescu, Andy Murray. Cam Norrie had, in his own words, a shocker, and we are very much Britless going into the second week of the fourth week, I should say, of the Sunshine Swing. We'll also talk about what's going on with the National Academies, because it's not been a great week for them over here in the UK either. Casper Ruud's continuing his dreadful run of form. There's no Iga Świątek in Miami, full stop, but there is a Barbora Krejcikova who thinks we should be talking about her a little bit more, and who knows, in a couple of months there might even be a Juan Martín del Potro. Yes, lads, Calvin is very, very excited. But let's start at the top with your questions. We don't always start with your questions, but I thought we should, really, because we went out there and asked for them. We had lots of responses. And we're going to start with Carlos Alcaraz, who is, of course, the world number one, although as Simon Briggs wrote in his column today, he can't really be considered the proper world number one until he's up against a fit-firing and bubbling Novak Djokovic at a Grand Slam, and arguably the same for Rafa and Nadal as well. He's beaten Facundo Bagnis and Dusan Lajovic this week already in Miami, picking up a bagel in each match. It's Iga Świątek-esque, and in the words of The Guardian, he's the best in the world, and he's only going to get better. But how good is he in terms of the big three? Elena Tsourdi's been in touch and said, what aspects of the respective game of Roger, Rafa and Novak do you see in Carlos Alcaraz, and what specific improvements should he make, apparently considering he has only reached 60% of his potential? That is according to Juan Carlos Ferrero, his coach, of course, who I should say is biased because he has been coaching him for quite a long time. George, what elements of his game do you see? The cliche, and I'm potentially going to step on your toes here, but the cliche is to say that he's got the forehand and aggression of Roger, the durability and fitness of Rafa, and I can't remember what he's supposed to do like Novak, but that's the cliche, right?
Okay. Well, so I was going to say the forehand and aggression of Roger, so that has been stolen from me. I was going to say I think he's got very good movement like Novak. He's very quick around the court. He defends very well as he attacks. So I think that probably does chime in with that kind of durability side. And I think for Rafa, for me, to be honest, is more his like presence on court, the way he kind of goes around fist pumping, getting the crowd hyped up. Like he does feel like someone who really thrives off getting the crowd engaging with him. So I feel like that's probably the biggest similarity to Rafa in terms of style. But he is just, at the end of the day, we're going to look back on him and think he is the Carlos Alcaraz, though, isn't he? I mean, he's a phenomenal player. He's not identical to any of them. I think you can tell he's benefited from growing up watching what these guys all do well, but he's kind of pulling all the pieces together and becoming this frightening hybrid super beast. So yeah, he's certainly, it is quite scary, as Ferrero says. I don't know, I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it. 60% sounds quite low to me because he already seems pretty close to kind of the 90% of what I'd expect Alcaraz could be. I can't really envisage another 40% of Alcaraz getting better, to be honest.
Calvin, where do you see, with a critical eye, where do you see that next sort of fall? I mean, I should say that Ferrero quote, 60%, is from the US Open last year, so he may even have picked up 10 or 15 since then. But where do you see the finishing touches to Carlos Alcaraz's game coming from?
I'm glad George touched on that, because I did think the 60% was absolutely ludicrous. To say he's got another 40% improvement. To give you some idea, right, his average serve is about somewhere between 125 and 130 mile an hour. If he got an extra 40% on that, he'd be serving at 182 miles an hour on average, right? Which would be 40 miles an hour faster than the fastest serve ever. So it is just, there's no way he's only at 60. Even at the US Open, he wouldn't. If he finds, and this is not to put him down, because this in tennis is an enormous amount. If he finds an extra 6 or 7 or 8% from now until the end of his career, he'll be very, very dominant. If he finds an extra 15%, he'll win about 90% of the slams for the next 15 years. I'm certain of that. That's how much the percentages are. That I don't know whether that was lost in translation with Ferrero or not, but it's definitely not that. In terms of where he would improve, again, there is some improvement to be made on serve. There's no question of that, as you'd expect at 19. Nobody's serving their fastest at 19 years old. He is, and I have to say this in inverted commas, he's only 6'1", so there's a chance he still grows. He's probably got possibly another 4 or 5 years of growth, to be honest. Players do still but males do still keep growing up until they're 25. Other than that, it's just experience and tactical nous and that kind of thing. But he's a pretty complete player. This is when people say it's difficult now to say what elements of each player does he have, because all of those players are already pretty complete. Federer, Djokovic, and Nadal. They don't really have weaknesses, and they all have similar strengths, if you will, with a little bits of variation. It's not like back in the era before that, where you could say like Sampras and Agassi, where you could say somebody had Agassi's return and Sampras's serve, and they played completely different. Let's be straight. Even Federer, I would think bizarrely people seem to think Federer was some sort of serve volleyer at one stage in his career, and it's never really been the case. He played 90% of his points from the baseline, as do Nadal and Djokovic. Federer maybe 2 or 3% more, but they're all pretty similar. So he's like George said, he'll just be his own. It's not there's not elements of each player.
I mean, just on the Federer point, I remember watching that Federer-Sampras match. I mean, okay, it's Wimbledon in like 2002, I think. 2001, is that right? So basically everyone was serving volleying a whole lot more anyway. But yes, I take your point. George, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was going to say, Calvin sort of touched upon it with the experience side of things. I think that'll obviously be the thing that develops. And there were times last year before he won the US Open where there were a few kind of mental confidence wobbles that I kind of feel like that's just an area he will naturally grow in. It'll become more normal to be in really big matches, and it wasn't necessarily the biggest matches he actually kind of had those wobbles. There's one with Tommy Paul, wasn't there? I can't remember exactly where it was, but where he kind of said he had a complete crisis of confidence, which felt, very out of character. That's not the sort of thing I'd expect to kind of keep happening in his career as it goes on. I mean, the other thing just to say is, he's already talking about catching Novak and Rafa and motivated by doing that, which, the guy's won one Grand Slam, but you're already kind of looking at him like there's probably a fairly realistic chance you can put yourself in that conversation, just from a perspective of you've got the target to aim for, it's doable now. That does make a little bit of a difference, and he is just so awesome already, and the rest of the field doesn't feel that close to him or his potential really at the moment. So, we often talk about how, Federer and Nadal, Djokovic, they needed each other to kind of raise their games and bring the levels up with them. But now the record's so much higher, that in itself, I feel, will be quite a big motivation, as it was for kind of Roger to get to Sampras. Now, they don't, pushing higher was difficult because of it not been done before. And people are like, oh yeah, you can't do that. Whereas now it's like, yeah, that number seems pretty achievable. I'm comfortably the best young guy in the world. Why not?
Yeah, just to you mentioned those quotes, George, that came out, I think, just middle of last week. He said, thinking about a goal for this year, I have to win a Grand Slam, or at least try to win another Slam, and more Masters 1000 events. Those are big goals for me. Staying at world number one, you get there by winning majors and Masters. No secrets. I'll do my best to try and win these kinds of tournaments. I want to beat Nadal and Djokovic, but I'm not here to take away Grand Slams from them or prevent either of them from being the best of all time. I'm just trying to write my own history. And I kind of look at that and I think about what Dominic Thiem, for example, has said, and Medvedev a little bit as well, although I think his mindset was probably a bit stronger, about the difficulty of the post Grand Slam debut title. And, it happens to so many sporting people. They talk about achieving that goal they've dreamed of for their whole life, and then just having this huge, almost like an adrenaline dip, where it's just like you wake up on Monday morning, or more likely Tuesday morning, and go, oh, what now? I've done it. I don't feel any different. I haven't grown an extra limb. Like I'm still just Dominic. What now? And I think for Alcaraz, what's been really impressive, okay, he went and lost in that Davis Cup tie, didn't he? Straight off the back of it. And he's had an injury problem. But for the most part, I don't feel like he's really had that sort of, or not at least outwardly, that big mental drop-off. And I think when you hear him talk about, I'm going after Nadal and Djokovic, it's because that's where his mentality is. And maybe having someone like Ferrero in your camp is really valuable there, because, all right, he's never been the best in the world, but, well, I suppose he was world number one, so he has technically been best in the world, but he knows that feeling, right? And he can literally say, I know what you're feeling like this morning, and this is what we're going to do to kind of deal with it, Calvin.
Yeah, I just still loving it. You going, he's never been best in the world. If only there was some sort of metric that we could. I think that what he'll find is that what could be a blessing and a curse for him is that, as we touched on there, that there is no real. I don't see who's going to be his real rival in this, because you look at them and there's some good players around. But is there any other who you could think could be a rival in an all-time great conversation? And I'm not sure at the minute that there is. But also, when we look at sports, is, as we've said before, sport is based on rivalries. And if you look at the greatest, who we discuss as the greatest tennis players of all time, Nadal, Djokovic, Federer, Sampras, McEnroe, Borg, these type of guys, they all had a big rival. And if you look at the ones who we never discuss, it's because there wasn't really a rival. Lendl, players like that, Connors, I guess, early on in his career. There's no real rival, and I think that could be his problem. It could be in his favour that he could end up winning a hell of a lot, but I do wonder whether he's going to fall into that And it's really early days, to be honest, because Djokovic at 19, I think people thought he was very good. I don't think anyone thought he was going to be this good when he was 19, even when he'd won a slam. But I do wonder whether Alcaraz might fall into in say 15, 20 years time going, yeah, well, who did he beat? And that kind of conversation.
Yeah, and you mentioned Djokovic at 19. Remember that joint press conference that him and Murray did in Australia, and no one was talking about Novak Djokovic. They were all talking about Andy Murray as, the next big thing. But anyway, that's beside the point. Yes, dance partners are absolutely crucial. It's the same with all individual sports. Woods needed Mickelson, Palmer needed Nicholas, whatever. The boxers are absolutely the same. AJ needs to fight Tyson Fury, or people are going to say, what did Anthony Joshua ever really achieve? He only fought Klitschko once, and it was an aging Klitschko. We're already seeing that kind of narrative spun in.
Well, Mike
in
Tyson's the big one, isn't he? Like, Mike Tyson never beat another top 50 of all time boxer.
You might put Riddick, Bowe,
He didn't beat Bowe, did he? Never fought him.
Well, they fought three. So did Tyson not fight Riddick Bowe three times?
No, that was
Have I
Holyfield.
not made that up?
That was Holyfield.
Oh, is that what I'm thinking of? Okay, fair enough. But yeah, I mean, it will always denigrate your legacy if you don't have that great dance partner. When we're looking, and Georgia will come to you, I promise. When we're looking at Alcaraz's career, I guess if you're thinking I want him to be regarded as one of the greats, you're hoping that the likes of Holger Rune, Yannick Sinner, I guess Tsitsipas, he's 5 years older than him, but maybe a Felix Auger-Aliassime who's 3 years older than him. You need those kind of guys to go with him, to run with him and play him in finals. I mean, that Alcaraz-Sinner match at the US Open, what was it, quarterfinal last year? That was pretty epic, and I think those two might have some pretty epic struggles. I do worry they might be a bit like that period of Nadal versus Djokovic that Calvin really hates, when they just slugged it out from the baseline for like 6 hours. But I mean, I quite enjoy that sort of nonsense. So, George, you were saying?
Yeah, I think there's a few kind of points about Alcaraz's career. I think, first of all, kind of going back to comparing to Medvedev and Thiem. I mean, the good thing for Alcaraz is he's got the Grand Slam monkey off his back so early in his career. It's not like, he's going to go into a load of finals, lose them. The US Open really opened up nicely for him to kind of win that first one. I know there were lots of good matches in that where I'm not saying it was an easy one, but in the recent landscape, and considering how good Novak and Rafa were at the slams they were playing over the last kind of 12 months, he's managed to get over the line quite quickly in a similar way to Djokovic beating Tsonga in his first slam final. That's much easier than kind of Medvedev and Thiem. So there's maybe less of that emotional release in the sense that it happened quite quickly. And then, the other side of it, I still think there's players out there that can make Alcaraz interesting, but this year feels very important to me in his career and where we shape it. Like, we need those big matches with Novak this year. That's what people remember this little era for, I think, like for Alcaraz. We need him playing Medvedev a lot. We need Zverev get it, as much as you like or hate Zverev was at a level where he could be a serious contender with Alcaraz, and of course beat him at the French last year. There are players out there who can certainly rival him and have another 5-6 years in the game. And then, in 5 years' time, there could easily be another Alcaraz coming behind him. You never know what's going to come around the corners. But that rivalry with Novak this year, it feels so frustrating that that's not happening regularly, because it should be happening regularly apart from vaccine, whatever. We're not going to turn that rock over again, but that is the only reason that matchup is not happening regularly right now, and that is bad for tennis. So hopefully we can get that back on track soon.
Yeah, I mean, Alcaraz Djokovic is basically, I mean, it's the only thing people really ask me about. It's like, I'd say, who's won the world? Carlos Alcaraz, yeah. Is he as good as Djokovic? Like, well, I don't know. He played him once and he beat him, so maybe, but we simply can't know. So thank you, Eleanor, for your question, which, if anyone remembers, actually triggered this whole conversation and has given us first 20 minutes of the podcast. So I hope that's answered some of your questions. On a totally different note, Ian Warren, WazzaMelbourne, says, with all the money in tennis, lol, can they not afford to pay for world feed TV commentators to be on site at tournaments rather than sitting thousands of miles away. I might take this, and if anyone else wants to jump in on it afterwards, then feel free. But you have to remember that the world feed commentators are essentially the ones that are not paid for, if that makes sense. Like, if you've got a budget broadcaster who's just picked up the rights on a whim in some random country, they will take the world feed. Now, that's not to do down what they do. There's plenty of loads of really good people who, I mean, Nick Lester does a lot of world feed work, and he's arguably the best commentator out there, albeit perhaps in our WhatsApp group we would argue it's quite a low bar. But they're not the guys who are being paid for by a broadcaster who needs it to look good. They are the people who are essentially the default, or like I don't know if I'm explaining this the right way, but of course they're not going to fly them all over the world. If they can do it what's called off tube in the industry, then they will, because like why would you shell out for commentators to go all over the world for however many weeks of the year? It's a lot of money. Tennis is a very expensive sport to cover in person, and I kind of sympathise with the tours for not flying commentators to every corner of the globe. I don't know if anyone else has anything more to say on that.
I guess the only thing I'd say is I do think it's good when they're at the tournaments. If I was paying for that kind of thing, I guess I'd be questioning, do you really need to be there? Does it make any difference to the job that you do? I think at some of the tournaments it can do. You know, you tend to pick up inside information. You can see how someone's been practicing and that kind of thing if you're at the tournaments. But I can see why they're not. And at the same time, if tennis is going to move, I mean, it already kind of has moved into this, but if it's going to continue to be showing all the courts at all the tournaments, I'd rather that happen than be spending that money on shipping Annabelle Croft round to commentate on more tennis matches.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a degree of quality that could be improved by having people there more often who aren't necessarily big names who are going to be worried about upsetting people. I think there's probably a degree where it would be nice to have a commentator who's kind of on the ground quite often, going to a lot of tours, getting to know people a bit more and being able to give a bit more insight into, some of the people or things they've picked up in the week, that little bit of anecdotal. There's a lot of dead space in tennis where actual interesting commentary can be, or should be, a more appreciated art. And, I'm not digging out commentators because it's also just it's not that easy a job sometimes. You're commentating on a dud match, but like you can be there for a lot of hours and thinking, I don't feel like as someone who knows the sport fairly well, I don't feel like I'm learning that much here. You get some who are really good technically, like Pecci and Coria, or even McEnroe. I know some people don't like him, but he gives you that top level insight of like one of the greatest athletes of all time. One of the sports, you can't get that. But there are other commentators in other sports who they bring a lot just by they're there week in, week out. They know people, they see things, they can bring a kind of flavour to what's going on. They speak to people in the grounds and stuff. There's all sorts of little nuggets of things that I do find is often missing from tennis, to be honest.
I think that's a good point you made there, George. And I know a friend of mine told me a couple of years ago that I'll come back to that in a minute. What's interesting is when you speak to commentators, they'll always tell you that they're not commentating for the likes of, I guess, us three who are presenting here, or even most of our listeners. They're commentating for people who don't watch tennis. Now, that's fine, and I do have sympathy for that. But then I spoke to a friend of mine a couple of years ago who was talking about sort of sports commentary, and he says when he watches tennis and he listens to the commentary, he feels like he doesn't learn anything about how the game's played, the strategies, that kind of thing. So they might be trying to do that, but they're not achieving it. Whereas when you watch the sports that I don't really know a lot about, cricket, or not to an expertise level, cricket, darts, golf, I feel like I'm being told things that I find interesting and are making me understand the game a bit more. And I do think that that's where tennis really lacks in commentators. There are some who do it, like James said. Nick Lester's excellent. Petch is top class. There are a few more. Jim Courier I find really good. But there are too many who, I do think there's an element of too many who just want to praise everything and never criticize and don't really tell us anything about the game.
There is a plague of the niceties in tennis, as we well know. It's one of the reasons that this podcast kind of exists the way that it does. There are a lot of people in tennis who think that the only reason to exist is to say nice things about the sport. Sometimes you have to not say nice things. Just on Jim Courier, because you mentioned him, for anyone who didn't see this week, Vance, who is a prolific tweeter, who's an American, and he tweeted, "Nothing better than listening to Jim Courier commentate a match. Knowledgeable, analytical, critical, but also empathetic. Pretty humble for a former player who won 4 majors in his career. Comes into the booth so well prepared and researched too. Breaks info down intelligently." And I read that and thought, yeah, he's spot on. I do love Jim Courier. Stefanos Tsitsipas clearly also read that tweet as well and did his own tweet saying, "Jim Courier's tennis commentary is a pleasure to listen to. His impressive combination of understanding, analysis, empathy and humility is always backed by thorough preparation. He breaks down the game in a way that is both impressive and inspiring." Stefanos Tsitsipas' record for ripping off tweets is almost unrivaled. And my favourite, the sort of crowning glory of this little tale, John Millman tweeted, "Jim Courier is a pleasure to listen to in the commentary box. It's an impressive skill to be knowledgeable." I just directly ripped it off and then followed with a little winking emoji, which really made me laugh.
Are we all on his payroll?
I do think, like, on that though, I think this is again where tennis, I guess it's the producers of the product that get this wrong. I mean, for anyone who didn't watch Jim Courier play tennis, right? He basically had invented the big inside out forehand. It was huge. His inside out forehand and dominating it with it was huge, and that's what he built his whole game around. Now there was a match about, I think it was maybe last year's US Open or around then, where Jim was commentating with Tim Henman, and they were talking about somebody's inside-out forehand. And for, I guess, for people who don't understand this, you tend to have a colour commentator and then a kind of a pundit, a play-by-play and a colour. Would that be right, James? Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK we call it a commentator and a summariser.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, you get someone who's a broadcaster who does the sort of the basic what's going on, and then an expert who gives you the sort of punditry.
And basically, Jim was doing the commentary role in that match, and Tim Henman was doing the summarising. So you had a situation where Jim Courier was asking Tim Henman, and I think Mark Petchey, how to hit inside-out forehands. And I thought, this is absolutely ludicrous. This guy had maybe the best, certainly the first, and maybe the best ever. And no disrespect to Tim or Petch, that their inside-out forehands weren't remotely on the level of Jim Courier. And he was asking them, and I thought, how have you messed this up where Jim's asking these two how to hit forehands?
I mean, the thing is that basically the ideal commentary team is Jim Courier commentating and then Jim Courier doing the punditry. Because, I mean, again, not to do down Henman and Petch, but I think probably if you're a producer and you know you've got Jim Courier, like, well, he's really good at both. Which would we rather have him do? So... And I always think if you've got a really good broadcaster, you're best off utilising them as the anchor, because they can be the glue that holds it together. They can poke people in the right directions, and they can elevate other people. Whereas if you're the kind of co-host or the summariser, it's quite difficult to elevate people in the same way, George.
That's why our podcast always falls apart when you're off, James. So I have to step in doing that.
It's very, very flattered. Very flattered indeed.
Stop throwing away leftovers and buy Hampton Homeware's 40-piece food storage container set with airtight snap-on lids. It's 28% off on Amazon. It includes 24 labels and an erasable marker. And coming in late April, you can also shop the kitchen cooking utensil set. You'll get 33 silicone pieces that won't scratch or damage your expensive nonstick cookware. Start shopping today at the Hampton Homeware Amazon storefront.
Right, let's move on to a question from LynneyPin, who says, "What's happened to Casper Ruud?" This is a question I have asked myself and many other people over the last couple of weeks. And indeed, he was in all sorts of bother. Well, in fact, he wasn't. He was looking like he might actually beat Botic van der Zandschulp. And then George, was he 3-1 up in the decider and blew it from there?
Yeah.
And, I mean, how?
Well, I mean, confidence is just a funny thing, isn't it? I think the thing we said about Casper Ruud all of last year was that he's not going to be, in our opinion, beating the very best players in the world on a regular basis in the biggest matches. But what he can do is beat the players he's supposed to be beating, in inverted commas, and give himself a chance of going deep in tournaments by just taking care of business. Now, if you turn into this year, bearing in mind, and this is another point, it may well be the curse of the dreaded ATP finals, which have long been the moment where you think, oh, is this guy going to do well next year? Reached the final, of course, lost to Djokovic. Since then, he's lost to Laszlo Djere. He lost to Jenson Brooksby at the Australian Open. Lost to Taro Daniel, Taro Daniel actually bageled Zverev this week, so he's on a good few weeks.
Yeah, I'm not going to justify. I don't think we should try and like sugar the pill. He lost to Taro Daniel. Yeah. We all know what that means.
He lost to Garin at Indian Wells, and now he's lost to Van der Zandschulp. And the players he's beaten this year is Schwartzman, who is a guy who's really declining now. To be honest, he's not where he was. Ivashka, Andreozzi, and Machak. Those are his only wins this year. That's a fairly unremarkable set of wins and a fairly remarkable set of losses. So that's not looking very good. And yeah, he's, I think, around 80th in the live race at the moment.
I mean, he hasn't won back-to-back matches this year. He hasn't won back-to-back matches since the Tour Finals, and since he reached the final of the US Open, I believe he's 12-12. I mean, we had just about got to the point where we were saying, crikey, we're going to have to stop underrating Casper Ruud, because he's reached 2 of the last 3 Grand Slam finals, and he seems to be a really efficient player. He's not just picking up points on clay. Calvin, do you think that we will look back on 2022 and just go, oh yeah, that was that really weird year that Casper Ruud reached 2 Grand Slam finals?
It's possible, yeah. I do think there's an element that he's regressed to the mean. I think he'll get better than what he has done now. I really don't see him being a contender or a top 5 player again. I think he'll probably settle somewhere around about 12 to 15 in the world. If you look, he's had such a strange career, to be honest. I mean, even last year he made 2 Grand Slam finals. There was a period where he could have gone world number 1. I can't remember what match it was. Yeah. Was it
if he won the US Open
final?
Yeah. And he was in that match at the US Open final. But at the same time, has he still not won anything above a 250?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and I think his record against top 10 players was also abysmal for somebody who could have been world number 1.
It's insane. I mean, like he never, apart from his 2 Grand Slam finals, he's only got past the 3rd round of another slam once.
Yeah,
and obviously he's been to World Tour finals a couple of times, and like he's never won a Masters title, as you discussed, but he's made the final and like quite a lot of semis, albeit mostly on clay. I just can't put, like, he seems like a good player, but maybe that's it. Like 11 to 15 in the world, that's where you find a lot of good players who just don't quite have real weapons.
Any shouts for a worse world number 2 in men's tennis history?
Oof.
Oh, that is very tricky.
I mean, there were some in the sort of the lost period. What I always think about it between Sampras and Agassi, and
is that when you had like Rios at number 1?
I mean, Rios was good Rios just had Rios had a freakish 8 months where he was as good as anybody, but got ripped off of a slam by Peter Korda potentially doping. And then
do I need to check with a lawyer about that? Like, how
he got done for it. No, he got found guilty for it. He got banned for it.
Fine.
But they don't. The period where he was found guilty for it was when he won the Australian Open, beating Rios in the final. And up until that period, Rios had been completely dominant. And then I think Rios went. I was looking at this not long ago. I think after that Australian Open, when he lost the final, he won Miami and Indian Wells. I think losing just 1 set. In that period, but you had that sort of period where the world number one was changing all the time. It was like every 3 or 4 weeks where you had Moya, Costa, Safin, Hewitt, Rios.
But I'd consider all those players better than Casper Ruud.
Yeah, but they'd been world number one.
I know,
Well,
but who were number two in those?
Okay,
periods?
so I've
Presumably
got
all-
a list. I have a list of all the ATP world number twos. I'm going to throw a couple of names out there. Alex Corretja,
He's been number
I
one
don't-
though, hasn't he?
but I mean he's also been world number two. Like
No, Corretja was good. Corretja was way better than.
was Corretja world number one? Sorry, I didn't challenge that,
Yeah.
but is that true?
I'm pretty.
I don't think he has been.
If he might not have been, but during that period, I remember he's won a slam. He won the French Open.
He hasn't won a slam either. Calvin, you're having a
he not?
nightmare here. He's
he
never
not?
made world number one. He had 2 French Open finals, 98,
Right,
2001.
okay, fair enough.
But so what you're saying is he wasn't that bad.
Oh, he was way better than Casper Ruud. Way better.
Okay. Manuel Orantes is not someone I've ever heard of.
No.
A single-handed backhand left-hander. He retired in 1984, and he did reach world number 2. Magnus Norman, who I only really know as a coach, but he also reached world number 2.
Magnus Norman is probably the player that I'd most liken Ruud to, because Norman also used to beat a lot of guys and make finals of stuff without beating any of the best players.
I see. And also really like clay. His most successful surface was clay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, if you can think of any worse world number twos, seems like another very unkind category after our worst ever top 20 players like a couple of weeks ago. But I'm fine with it. Do drop us a note on Twitter at Unfiltered Tennis, or you can even find us on Instagram, Tennis Unfiltered Pod, and sometimes I actually use it. But yeah, moving on. We've got another question to answer. John Williamson's actually sent in 3 questions, some of which we will answer as the show goes on. So I'll start with his first one, which is, how different will the WTA top 10 rankings look at the end of 2023? Now, the glib and funny answer is extremely, because it's the WTA and things can change extremely quickly. But in order to give you both time to think, I'll run you down the current top 10. Świątek, Sabalenka, Pegula, Garcia, Jabeur, Goff, Rybakina, Kasatkina, Sakkari, Bencic. Now, how many of those do we think, George, and I feel like we may have had this conversation 6 months ago, but how many of those do you think will not be in the top 10 by the end of the year?
So I was going to say, actually, for the first time in a while in women's tennis, I feel fairly certain a good portion of them will still be there. So, I mean, I'll be stunned if Świątek's not there. I'll be stunned if Sabalenka's not there. I'll be stunned if Rybakina's not there. I mean, Krejcikova's in at 11, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. So she, I do think she's someone who will come back in there. I think the players I'd be most worried about would be Kasatkina. I mean, Garcia, she for me is another one quite likely of dropping out. I think Pegula's pretty consistent. I think Goff, we're expecting him to keep going. Sakkari's been up and around there for a good couple of years now. Jabeur might be a bit vulnerable from the perspective I think she overachieved last year, and I think other players have just kind of gone past her quite significantly now. So I'd say she's as vulnerable as Kasatkina. Bencic is one of these players who just always seems to be in and around the top 10. So even though I don't necessarily think she'll push on much further, she feels like the David Goffin of the WTA at the minute, where she'll just be hanging around there for the next 5 years. I
mean, I think Ons Jabeur's an interesting one. She's number 5 in the world at the moment. The thing that is against her is she's got 2 very big gluts of points to defend, i.e. Wimbledon final. Oh, sorry, she doesn't have any Wimbledon final points to defend because they didn't happen. But she's got US Open final points to defend, which is like a big glut of points that will just come off in one go. Whereas, like, you think about someone like Daria Kasatkina, who I actually think won't end the year in the top 10, but the way her year was, or the last 12 months has been, it's been quite consistent, and she's picked up points as time's gone on. All right, she's had a couple of decent slam runs as well, but so I feel like she's less vulnerable just because, you have one bad week if you're Daria Kasatkina and it costs you a couple of 100 points. You have one bad week if you're Ons Jabeur, it costs you like 1,600 points or 1,200 points.
I think if you look at, there's always a point in the year where the race becomes more interesting than not, and it is probably a little bit too early. But if you look at the women's race now, you've got Sabalenka, Rybakina, Swiatek, Pegula, Krejcikova, Bencic, Goff. So your top 7 are already in the top 10. You've got Garcia 10, Sakari 11. Jabor's down at 50. I mean, she's not playing anywhere near the level she was. And I know she picked up a lot of her points on the clay and the grass. That's where we expect her to come more into her own.
Yeah,
but it felt like she was
bounced. She got bounced out of the French Open. She was actually out of the French Open before I arrived in Paris.
Yeah, but she picked up a lot of points before that, obviously, and
yeah.
She'll get a chance to pick up Wimbledon points as well. But I still, I feel like she had her best. I said it last year. I felt that was going to be the best chance she'd have to win Grand Slams, because I don't think she's like of the level to be a Grand Slam champion. I think things were just settled in the game at a good moment for her. Whereas, Sabalenka, Rybakina are playing good stuff at the minute. And so, Swiatek's not going anywhere. Krejcikova is, as I've just said, fifth in the race. She's kind of back low key, I think, and that's another good thing. And, that's a pretty strong 4. And then we're, hoping Goff's going to step on, whether she will or not. We'll wait and see, but she's still consistent enough to be 7 in the race. So, yeah, but the overarching point is this is good for women's tennis. I feel actually vaguely confident this top 10 will be fairly similar next year, which I've not felt for about 5 years. So, well done.
Well, the title of last week's podcast was, "Is this the best we've felt about tennis for quite some time?" on both sides in the ATP and WTA, because it's starting to feel like this is the thing, right? It's all about what's the optimal number of people who can win a slam, right? Because you want lots of different people to be able to win, because as we know from F1, when only 2 or maybe 3 teams can win a race, it's boring. But you also want to have some consistency and be able to tell a story and build something like that, which is, I think, why golf is quite difficult to sell to people, because during the tours and from the major perspective, it has to be more about the courses and the competition, because there are so many different names involved. Calvin, what do you think the optimum number of genuine contenders for a Grand Slam title is? Like, from a sort of health of the tournament perspective.
6 to 8.
Yeah,
I think. I think there was a period in men's tennis, I guess, in the late 90s, where I think there was a period where all of the top 10 had won slams, and in recent times,
yeah,
and I think that was a pretty good spot. But it's difficult to say, because you also come back to that period which we were just talking about, where I guess any of the men's top 10 could win slams at that period, but none of them were real superstars, and that's where the struggle was, that basically people stopped caring about the tournament because you had all these guys who'd won one tournament before. There was a period in women's tennis where I guess you had that period of sort of Graf, Selesh, Sabatini, Novotná, Martinez, Navratilova was still hanging around a little bit, and that was that was pretty strong. But yeah, I think somewhere between 6 to 8 is really good, I think.
And then you just got to hope that at least 4 of them make it through to the quarters, and you get and obviously, look, there are still great stories. Goran Ivanisevic winning Wimbledon went down in history. Ben Shelton's run at the Australian Open was a great story, and of course those are great. But when you're telling that story 3 or 4 times in a tournament, as you often are in WTA slams, then it's a bit of a problem, George.
Yeah, it's so much easier to establish the story if you've got bedrocks there that you're expecting. The thing about the Big Four era is, there was a period where they just felt like that every semi-final was Federer, Murray, Nadal, Djokovic. And if it wasn't one of them, then it was Del Potro, Wawrinka, or later on, Team.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, actually, the Wimbledon semi-finals that we should have had this year in the men's, of Djokovic against Norrie and Kyrgios against Nadal, is like almost perfect, because you've got 2 established megastars you've got one very popular but maverick bloke who we think could be a star, and then you've got the home favourite. Like, that's like almost the Hollywood makeup. And then obviously the Hollywood final is Djokovic versus Nadal. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. We didn't get it, didn't happen. I was thinking about like the era when about 100 different people could potentially win a men's slam. The lost era, I think Calvin called it, just post Sampras, pre Federer. And the list of people who won slams in chronological order was Safin, Agassi, Kuerten, Ivanisevic, Hewitt, Johansson, Costa, Hewitt, Sampras with that rogue 2002 US Open, Agassi, Ferrero, and then Federer wins his first one, and then things become a bit more normal. But yeah, that little sort of 3-year period, I remember that because I was, without giving too much away, just sort of becoming nascent and conscious of the wider sporting context of things that were on the telly. And I do remember being like, oh, there's a different person here every week, and this is like a bit strange.
Yeah, I also similarly remember. It wasn't that I didn't watch much tennis, and it was more I didn't watch much tennis outside of Wimbledon before that point. And I remember going to a tennis camp one week, and they looked at who the world number one was and were showing some clips of him, and it was Juan Carlos Ferrero, and I was like, oh, this guy's really good. Let's look at him, and he was absolutely terrible beyond that. So it was a brief love affair with Juan Carlos Ferrero, who I decided was my favourite player for about a 4-week period.
Very good. Right, well, if you do want to ask us any questions for future episodes, then head over to Twitter. I try and post something on there on a Monday morning or a Sunday evening just saying, what are your questions? So you can always reply to that, or you can just DM us, or... there's so many ways. You can email us. It's a very popular option. People like sending emails, even though it feels very old-fashioned. It's tennisunfiltered@gmail.com. And I will thank Saif Shaheen for his email, which I didn't read out, even though it's 2 weeks ago. To be honest, Saif, it's quite a complicated question. Saif is a PhD at a university in the Netherlands, and I would say it goes into the details of various different wars that I don't know enough about. I'm going to simply answer with, these war crimes are worse than those ones. And I think that might sort of sum up the debate that like we could spend 15 minutes having. But I think, Saif, maybe you'll just have to come on for a special episode and school us all about them. But that's just my particular opinion. Anyway, if you want to send an email that's not about the war, tennisunfiltered@gmail.com.
When you started talking about like a PhD in war, I was wondering if he's like doing a PhD on like the effect of war on tennis ball durability or something, like some completely niche PhD subject. But no,
I wish that were the case, but I believe it's something to do with digital culture. I'm just going to basically say, Saif, you're much more intelligent than we are. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And everyone has an opinion, and that's fine too. Let's move on, shall we? As I mentioned in the opening, it's been a pretty awful week in Miami for the British players. Andy Murray beaten by Dusan Lajovic, Emma Raducanu beaten by Bianca Andreescu, although no great shame in that, you would say. Cam Norrie had, in his words, a shocker, as he was beaten by Gregory Barrère in his opening round of the Miami Open in conditions that you would think would suit Cam. Dan Evans beaten by Lorenzo Sonego in 3 sets. Calvin, which of those results do you think is the worst? Because it's quite a strong field.
I don't think Evo's is a bad one, because Sonego's a good player. He just doesn't turn up all the time. And Evo's always... The players you don't want Evo playing against is the tall guys with loose arms and easy power, and that's what Sonego is. I actually watched the match, and Evo's in one of those periods where I don't think he's playing his best tennis he's ever, but he's not playing terrible. He's just struggling to get over the line, and certain things just aren't going in his favour. Like, I think he had 13 break points, and he only won one of them. And I think that was in the first game of the match. On top of that, he had the game where Sonego won the second set when he served for it. There was a few break points in that, it was really tight. And then Sonego won the set with one of the best shots I've ever seen. Evo played a backhand volley into the open court, but kind of got it behind Sonego, and Sonego absolutely leathered a passing shot up the line for a winner from behind him. So those things just happen when they're not, when things are just going against you. I think the worst one, it's a bad one for Murray, wasn't it? It's just it's a difficult one to pick out because he still is, he's still got a metal hit, but we can't just keep saying that. But it's just a bad result, and I don't know if there's even anything to read into it. I don't think there is, because he's been playing well up until then. Players can just have bad days. He's always had bad days. There's been, even when he was at his prime, he'd go to a Masters, and he'd about 1 in every 8 he'd have a bad first round, and it could just be that.
I noticed a stat of interest from Craig O'Shaughnessy, who I know Calvin has a long-running feud with, but he points out that Murray hit 201 ground strokes and only 3 winners. Now, obviously, Lajovic is a good defender, but that would suggest that he wasn't exactly striking the ball as best he can. George, what do you think is the worst result for the Brits there?
Yeah, hard to disagree with that. I'm probably more disappointed in Norrie, though, against Barrere. Just feel like that's a match he should be winning, and to lose it 3-2 is a bit of a stinker, to be honest. Norrie, he got quarters last week, so I guess wasn't a terrible result, but I think he'll leave here a little bit frustrated, to be honest. Came in having had 2 good weeks on the clay in South America. Felt like there were opportunities to win these tournaments, even, notwithstanding how well Alcaraz is playing and Medvedev. He's TFO's. It's not a bad loss, but it's someone it's a match I thought he would win, to be honest. And then to follow that up with a first round defeat to Barrere just leaves it a little bit flat at a time where, this was a chance for Norrie to pick up some points, really, some big points, and kind of take another step forward. So, I think he'll be disappointed.
And he's now dropped out of the top 10. He's down to 12 in the world, I think. He's obviously coming onto the clay, which I actually, funnily enough, sort of look at Norrie and think there's no reason he shouldn't be able to play on clay. But with the way he has grown up, he will not have played very much of his tennis on that surface, because obviously playing in New Zealand and then coming over to the UK, and then his kind of, his real development was done in the States, where what clay there is mostly green, and it doesn't play on a huge amount of it anyway. So, in fact, Calvin, you'll know this better than me, but do the NCAA tournaments, are they specifically on hard courts, or do they have some clay stuff, or does it depend on the college if they choose to play on clay?
I don't know as there's many colleges that have clay courts where they play their matches. There might be a clay court tournament, but I don't think there is. I know they're vast majority hard courts. Some of them have indoor hard, and some colleges recruit players who specifically are very good on indoor hard, like Ohio State do that. They've got very fast indoor hard courts, and the guys from Ohio tend to be tall guys with huge serves. But certainly in Texas A&M, where Cam went, they don't play on clay there.
No. But nevertheless, my point was, I sort of look at Cam's game and think, well, he backs himself to be like the fittest guy out there. Clay can be pretty attritional. He should think that he can, extract a decent amount of spin from that big forehand, and I guess his flat backhand's a bit weak on the surface. But I don't know. It just strikes me that, George, this was an opportunity for him to pick up decent points. Get himself deep into the top 10, maybe. Capitalise on the fact that there are a couple of big names not playing, and try and do some damage, and he hasn't. So he's currently on holiday with his dog and his partner. So hopefully he's going to refresh himself a bit, and then we'll see him in Europe giving the clay a bash. The one British name you might be surprised I didn't mention was that of Jack Draper. He never even made it to Miami. He didn't play in Miami because the oblique strain that forced him to retire against Carlos Alcaraz ruled him out of Miami. I think that news broke pretty much as we were recording last week, but I neglected to mention it. He is, we understand, back on court, which would suggest that his injury is not so bad as it needs surgery or anything like that. But, I mean, Calvin, it's just such, again, it's a similar type of injury. I don't know. I don't know how much more there is to say about Jack Draper having abdominal issues, but it just keeps happening, doesn't it?
Yeah. I don't think it's the same injury as it had issues with before, but
okay.
it does have those issues with abs, and just the guy plays so intense. He plays so hardcore, and there's a lot of rotation in that, and you can see why that kind of thing happens. But yeah, hopefully it won't keep happening. He can't. If he's going to fulfill his potential, Jack, which I think he will, he's going to, at some stage, he's going to have to start playing more tournaments and completing more tournaments. And I think, I'm sure he knows that, and his team know that. He's got a new fitness trainer this year, hasn't he? So, yeah.
Yeah, as I say, I don't know how much more there is to say about Jack Draper getting injured again, sadly, and I feel desperately sorry for him. I mean, I guess the key is to try and keep his head up. It was interesting what he said, or the statement that he put out when he pulled out, was that, my focus is on playing as many tournaments as I can at the moment, and like match court stuff. But as you say, you've got to be fit if you want to play those tournaments. Clay is, like Norrie, by no means his favourite surface. Unlike Norrie, I don't think Jack is a natural clay court player, to say the least, but assuming he's fit, we'll see plenty of him on the clay. He'll obviously be direct entry for the French Open, so we'll see him there. I think last year he was right on the cusp and potentially could have played qualies at Roland Garros, but I think actually with his fitness issues at that point of the year last year, chose not to and rather spent a bit of time on the grass. The big thing actually I note from him not playing in Miami is he drops nearly 20 places in the rankings, so he's outside the top 50 again, down to 61. Now, I'm not good at like rankings and entry list maths, Calvin, but does that mean presumably he's not going to be, or once that all filters through, he won't be direct entry into like the Masters series and stuff? I mean, I can already see 7th alternate for Monte Carlo.
Yeah, although is Monte Carlo a smaller draw?
Yeah, Monte Carlo's
the smallest.
Draw,
Yeah, like 56,
so I think he'd be okay for the others. To be honest, I'd be surprised if he's not.
Well, we wish him all the best, obviously, because I think we all like Jack, and we all want him to do well, and if British tennis does well, it's good for all of us. Now, the one player we haven't really mentioned, because I don't think she was in the running for worst British defeat of the week, was Emma Raducanu, who was up against Bianca Andreescu. She lost 6-3, 3-6, 6-2. Her first set was really, 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 really poor, with unforced errors almost up at 20, as I recall, off the top of my head. But she pulled it back to win the second set and then lost the decider. George, from a sort of narrative perspective, this was a nice match because both teenage winners of the US Open, both had their struggles with form and fitness after that, and then both trying to be resurgent. Andreescu a little bit further on in that journey than Raducanu is. No great shame in that defeat?
No, certainly not. No shame. It's notable Andreescu's then gone on to win a few more decent matches. Sakari was a good win for her. She beat Kenin. I mean, Lord knows exactly where Kenin's at, but she seems better than she was last year, so maybe that's not so much of a joke of a win these days. It did feel like, as you said, the narrative was very much, these two young US Open champions. It's not happened for them since, a lot of injuries since. Where are they going to go? And it's somewhat telling that Andreescu's very quickly gone somewhere and actually picked up a few big wins at a big tournament. And suddenly people are thinking, oh, is this the moment that she kind of turns things around? She's very much a player who, as we saw before her rise to winning the US Open, she was on a roll. She got up to about world number 4, I think, by winning the US Open. And she, at the start of the year, had been outside the top 150. I'm fairly sure. And that was a really sustained build-up. You'd say with Raducanu that there were maybe 2 tournaments that went well for her that year, like Wimbledon and the US Open. Like got to the 4th round and then did that. There wasn't that.
Yeah,
much.
I think the US Open went well. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah,
with
the
that.
US Open did go well, but I mean, in terms of that kind of sustained level of, high.
Well, she won that. She
plan.
got to the final in Chicago. But yeah, I mean, I know it's a challenger 125, but yes, I see what you mean. Like it's that maybe a slightly different arc.
Yeah.
It was interesting hearing. Sorry, George, did you have something else you want to say?
Well, I was just going to say, I think, it's not as direct a parallel as some might think, in the sense that, Andreescu was genuinely at the top of the women's game when she won the US Open. Raducanu was not at the top of the women's game when she won the US Open. So while she won the US Open, it was a nice draw. It opened up quite well. You still have to win all the matches. She still won 10 matches. It's still incredible. But it wasn't like Andreescu beat Serena Williams in the final, and I felt Andreescu was the favourite for the match going into it, and she dealt with a really kind of tough atmosphere, and she'd won a lot of big matches that year, and you were thinking, holy crap, this is going to be like one of the big women's players of this generation. She's young, she's talented, she's got a bit of spunk to her. That wasn't really the case so much with Raducanu, even though we were getting very excited about it. It wasn't that prolonged period of run up into that Grand Slam title. So yeah, it's probably a little bit unfair to kind of say, Andreescu's and Raducanu are exactly the same place, but it's not surprising me so much that Andreescu won that match. She's got a lot more kind of matches in and a lot more experience, and I would be quite confident in saying she'll be comfortably ranked higher than Raducanu come the end of this year. We can play that one back if I'm wrong.
In kind of typical Andreescu style, a couple of days later, she was talking about Raducanu, and she said, I'd love to talk to her about just like what happened after the US Open, all the success, all the media like that, how she dealt with it, how I dealt with it. Maybe we can help each other in that way. I mean, it's just, who knows? I suspect someone's put that question to her, but it's sort of classic Andreescu. She seemed like such a nice person that she would want to help out someone who's been through something similar. The concern for Raducanu, while her physical transformation, if you compare her to a year ago, is actually quite impressive. She's definitely stacked on some muscle. Actually, I was speaking to someone at the LTA who said to me a few months ago, well, next time you see Emma, because it was one of those periods where we didn't see a lot of her, he said, next time you see her, you'll notice. And to be fair, I saw a really good side-by-side photo on Twitter of a year ago compared to her in Miami, and it is noticeable. She has packed on a decent amount of muscle. The physical concern is that she is going to go and see a specialist about her wrist injury, which is still painful and still causing her some bother. I think what's interesting is I've seen her a couple of times refer to her wrists plural rather than just the right wrist, which is a slightly more troubling development, because I think if it was just a right wrist, it's like, okay, you've got a specific problem with a specific tendon. If it's both wrists, then that would suggest that it's something a little bit broader or something a bit different. So she's going to go and see a couple of specialists and see what she can do. I mean, wrist injuries, clay, I feel, Calvin, is not what you want to be playing on if you've got a wrist injury, right?
Yeah, I mean, you don't really want to be playing on anything if you've got a wrist injury, but yeah, clay's a difficult one with the clay. Just that you have to generate more spin anyway in general, and you're going to be hitting more balls. That's the problem there.
Yeah. I don't exactly know. I mean, I don't know if anyone has more to say about Raducanu in Miami. She played one match, she lost it, as we kind of discussed, and that's, she with her where her ranking is at the moment, she's going to get difficult draws in the first round sometimes, and some days she'll play well, some days she'll play badly, and I guess she's just going to have to hang on and hope things get a bit better.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably reflect on this Sunshine Double. It's felt very kind of par for the course, I would say, and what we're expecting from Raducanu. She won a match, she lost a match, but she won 2 matches this year in Indian Wells.
She won 3 in Indian Wells, and to
won
be
3.
fair,
Excuse
the
me.
win over Beatrice Haddad-Maia was one of the best. I watched that, and I think I said in the WhatsApp group, I said, because I'd been on holiday and it'd been my birthday and stuff, and I said, I've not watched a huge amount of tennis lately. I'm really enjoying this match. And she did. She played really well. She stepped inside the baseline. She played aggressively and beat a player who a lot of better players have struggled to beat in the last 12 months, and then she got
and
panned
Lynette.
Yeah,
Lynette
who,
as well.
funnily enough,
Good
I'm
results.
watching. Yeah, I'm watching as we speak, and she's getting pumped by Jesper Kuhler.
I think, but yeah, I mean, look, they're two players who are. I think they were both top 20 seeds. I don't think they're particularly top 20 players. I think they're decent players. That, you know, if I was making my list of worst players with the top 20, Magda, Lynette, and Haddad Maia probably wouldn't be far away from it, if I'm being perfectly frank. So like they're good wins in terms of where I think she's at. In terms of I think she can beat players somewhere ranked between 20 and 50 in the world. I think that's about, well, probably 20 to 80 is about her level at the minute, Raducanu, and 20 is really probably pushing it quite high at the moment. It's the other matches, you know, Swiatek's, she ain't anywhere near her at the moment. I think she did okay against Andreescu at points. Like, she dug in quite well. She made there's a really long game in that second set where she needed about 8 break points to get through Andreescu, but, you know, she kept really digging at it, and Andreescu kept coming up with amazing winners out of nowhere, and you're thinking, God, this must be demoralizing. You're getting all these chances, not taking it. And she got over the line and got a set there. So yeah, I think this has been a fairly positive couple of weeks in the context of where we've been, but it just speaks to the reality of where she is at the minute, that we're viewing these as greatly positive weeks. And, you know, context is very important, isn't it? You know, we think she can be a lot better than this, and I think that's where the frustration is. You know, we wouldn't judge many other players this harshly if we didn't all think she can be a really good player, and as shown, she has had really good results. I don't want us to get in the mindset where we think, yeah, this is good for Raducanu. She's beaten a couple of players who are okay. They're seeds by name, but if they weren't seeded at a tournament, I don't think you'd bat an eyelid. And then she got hammered by the world number one and lost to someone who's gone on to win a few matches and be talked about as someone who could be going back towards the upper echelons of the game. You know, we want Raducanu to win that match and have those conversations about her, because she's capable of doing that.
I kind of agree with George, and I kind of don't. And I think this is the problem with Raducanu. Not her problem; it's our problem, really. That we don't know how good she is, and we don't know what her potential is. You know, we're sort of coming saying, like George said there, we think she can be a lot better than that. But do we? Are we certain that, you know, say if Emma now has a career where she's kind of hovers around 25 to 20 in the world, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And I think that's a good career. If you take away this 1 3-week period in her career, everyone before that thought that was kind of what she was going to be. And she had this freak tournament. And I'm not sure that, you know, that I think there's a lot of people. I'm sure I'll get some stick for this, saying that I'm slating her, but I'm not. I'm not sure she's a top 10 player. I know she's got, like, you know, I know a lot of people do. I know a lot of people who've spent a lot of money on her think she is, or are hoping that she is. But you look at the top 10 players, and I'm not sure who she's better than in that, or even the top 15 or 20.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily like disagree with that at the moment, but I think she's a lot. Well, I say a lot. I think she should be better than where she is now. So she's 65 in the race at the minute, and you know, so that jump to 25 almost feels.
I don't know.
That's a next logical step.
Is she though? Is she better than 65 at the minute? You know, she's
no, possibly not. But
I think if you go off the Indian Wells results, I think yes. Like, to beat Haddad Maia, who, like, come on, Haddad Maia's had some serious results. To beat Lynette, who made an Australian Open semi-final, albeit, you know, a surprising one, but they're both players who are not easy to put away. Yeah, I think she is better than 65. Is she better than 30? Don't think so. Is she better than 40? Probably not. So I guess I would put her in that bracket. And as we know, WTA, like, 30 to 70 is a very similar kind of area.
Okay, but let me just come back on that. I just look now at the results. When you say if we go on that, that's where she is, right? So Vondrousova is in the last 16 of Miami at the minute, and she's ranked 106. Like, do we think Vondrousova is better than 65? You know, it's like the last 16 of a tournament. Like, players do it, especially in the women's game.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
that's why I think you have to take the results, and you also have to take, like, what have you done for me lately? You have to. I mean, look, you're right, Calvin. None of it is particularly scientific, and that is the nature of the ranking system, the randomness of the women's game at the moment. That very close kind of 0.1% between players at that level.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm not saying that I don't think she is or she isn't. I'm saying that it's so difficult to gauge on what is her level now. She doesn't play a whole lot, so we can't say on that basis. She comes, and sometimes she plays, she has great results. She looks great. I thought she played very well in Indian Wells. I agree. Then she'll not. We don't know when she's going to play tennis again, and then there'll be a match where maybe it doesn't look so great. So I don't know where she's at now. I also don't really know what her potential is.
Yeah, I sort of agree with you. The key is she's got to stay fit for an extended period of time, a bit like Draper in some ways. I mean, we've sort of seen, because Draper's, even though Draper hasn't won a slam, we've seen more of what he can do, if that makes any sense. But both of them need to stay fit more, George.
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious comparison there, but when you watch Draper, you see him really mixing it with people. You see someone who's playing in a very proactive, positive, really impressive game style, and you can see how he matches up against top players. Okay, he was rolled fairly comfortably by Nadal at the Australian Open, but he feels, because we've seen him play more regular matches against good players, we know what he is, or at least we feel a bit closer to know what he's capable of. As Calvin says, we've not really had that period of watching Raducanu regularly, week in, week out, for a long while. And yeah, I mean, wrist is not a very positive injury to be picking up, to be honest. So I hope this is something more minor than they're making out, because if it's a serious wrist problem on either thing, or a kind of chronic thing that they can't get rid of, that's not going to stand her in particularly good stead for the next while.
Just ask Dominic Thiem or Juan Martín del Potro, of whom more news a little bit later. But Calvin, Mike Dixon wrote a piece this week about, because we're talking about British players, and the reason we're so obsessed with Emma Raducanu is she's the only Brit inside the top 100, British woman, I should say, inside the top 100. And the news in the last couple of weeks is that the head of the LTA Academy in Loughborough is stepping down. The LTA system that was announced 5 years ago to feature these two academies, and there was a 10-year plan that they said would make Britain's talent development the envy of the world, and it feels like 5 years into that they're already kind of abandoning it. I mean, what is the UK's talent development like, without wanting to sort of set some pins up for you to knock down too much?
That academy system was on dodgy ground from the start, just by the people who set it up, and I don't really know what they were looking for from it. Simon Timpson set it up, and it seemed to be what he wanted for his legacy. Now I remember I was at the first, they had coach forums where they would basically put the idea out to let us know, and this was, I think it was probably 2017. And I went to one of those, and Simon Timpson was there laying out the project, and he said that at this stage they didn't know how many academies they were going to have, whether they were going to have 1 or 2 or even 5 they spoke about. But one of the things he said, they'd all have to match certain criteria if they were going to pay, if any venue was going to host an academy. And he said one of the criteria was that they were going to have 8 outdoor red clay courts just to be considered to have one of the academies. There was nowhere in the whole country that has 8 outdoor red clay courts. So that was a remarkable position to start on. So you were already, before you've even started looking at anywhere, you're already setting a criteria that no one has. No one's going to build any if they don't know they're getting 8 outdoor red clay courts, if they don't know they're getting an academy. Now, they ended up choosing 2 places, Loughborough and Stirling, which have 0 outdoor red clay courts. So, that was in itself was bizarre. Stirling has been an absolute disaster. The the staff that they've had, the coaches they've had haven't been good enough. The standard of like the people working at those academies that shouldn't be working at national academies or with national level players. And I don't mind saying that. I won't name names, but the coaching staff aren't there up there aren't good enough, and that's getting closed down in the summer or next summer. But I don't know whether it'll last that long. Loughborough has had Nick Cavaday's a very good coach. They've now got Morgan Phillips there, who's a very good coach. I'm not sure about some of the other coaches they've got there. I don't really know what their pedigree. Well, I don't know why they got the job on the pedigree that they've got because they haven't really coached. They were former players, hitters, that kind of thing. They have had a few good players come out of there. But as I said, I think Nick's a very good coach. They've had good people running it. Louis Caillet's been overseeing it. I know Martin Weston's been doing a bit of work there. These are good people. They know what they're talking about. So I'm trying to look at it from both sides here. Now the problem is, as I understand it, and this is purely from what I've read, is that Michael Bourne now wants the academies to be taking more players in. And I think he mentioned
Michael Bourne, for people who don't know, is head of performance. Is that right?
I don't know what his actual title is. It changes every 6 months or so. But yeah, he oversees the whole thing. So he said he wants 20. I think it's 28 or 24 players at these academies. Now it's pie in the sky stuff. We don't have. The problem with the academies as it is that we don't have enough players of a sufficient quality to be attending something that we're calling a national academy. Now, if you're a national academy, we should be talking about players who are or have the potential to be in the top 100 in the world in their age group. We just don't have enough of those in Britain. Now, I'm not going to say that's the LTA's fault or anybody's fault, but it's somebody's fault. Somebody's responsible for it. But because we've had a lot of those before. But we don't have it. Even, these national academies have got players in who are in their last year of juniors who are ranked 550 in the world, 300 in the world. You shouldn't be a national academy if that's the level that you're at. So talking about, and they've only got at the minute, I don't know how many players they've got at the minute. They've probably got about 14, 15 in total at the academies, but 28 players. You can't just decide. It has to be, this is not chicken and egg. It's not which comes first, right? If you want to have national academies to house 28 international standard players and elite international standard players, you better have 28 international standard players before you start setting up academies for them. And we just do not have that. And we won't have that. In order to produce that, you need to produce a culture and an environment, and that would in itself would take another 4 or 5 years, and there's things wrong further down the food chain. We have the British junior competition structure isn't good enough at the minute. It's got a bit better. It's still not good enough. The RPDC system, in my opinion, doesn't work. We're taking players out of clubs too early. Players aren't developing at the rate that they should do. We've got an issue, I think, with wanting to send all players to American uni, which I think it's an excellent idea for some players. I don't think it's a very good idea for other players, particularly girls. It's a problem. So I don't know where this goes, if I'm honest. I don't think, apparently they're not going to replace Nick Cavaday from what I read I don't have any inside info, it's what I read on in the articles at the weekend. They're just going to have a head of boys and a head of girls tennis at Loughborough. I don't know whether they'll set up another academy somewhere else to replace Sterling. I don't think they've got enough players to do that. But fundamentally, you've got to have, in order to have a successful academy, you've got to have enough players of required standard, and you've got to have good coaches. And we haven't had those. We don't have them. We're not France. We're not America.
I mean, this is a project I was also involved in fairly early in terms of, I was working for Metro at the time, and a lot of the kind of pitches of it being released, and talking quite a lot with Simon Timpson and other people about what they were going to do. And, there was obviously an awful lot of skepticism, and I think the real frustration from, at the time was, you'd ask a lot of these questions that you felt were kind of fair and on a lot of the points that Calvin's kind of raised there, and you'd get the reply, well, you're just going to have to see in 10 years. And then you've got Timpson leave within 2, and you're thinking, oh, bloody hell. I mean,
he went to Man City, right?
He went to Man City, so I'm not digging him out for that. If we all got offered a job at Man City at the minute, I'm fairly sure you'd probably take that over a pretty doomed project, you might say. But it's kind of British tennis all over, isn't it? That you just get these periods where they set on one idea and they run off with it for a bit, and they say, oh, actually, that was the wrong idea. And they'll run off the other way and go for a massive kind of huge participation approach as well. It is just eternally frustrating. I don't think there's necessarily a good answer for any of this. I'm not saying the ideas they were having were bad, but you could tell immediately Sterling was going to be a disaster. I'm not being rude to Sterling, but if you're in a national academy trying to attract people from around the country, sending them off where most of your tennis base as young players is not in Scotland. I know there's a long-term tension with the kind of Murrays that they want that infrastructure invested in Scotland, but it wasn't there. It just wasn't there. You were never going to convince people to want to go up there. You're never going to convince the coaches to go up there of the right caliber, in my opinion. And that's kind of completely proven true. So for that to be closing, 5 years into what was billed as this great 10-year project where they're going to tackle the pathway at every single age group, and they're going to bring forward all this amazing technology, and they're going to have national academies around the world looking at Britain like, wow, we want to be doing what they're doing. They've got this amazing talent ID abilities. It's just nonsense. It's just not even come close to happening. I've not seen one shred of evidence that any of these technological advances they were talking about have happened. And maybe they have, and maybe we've just not seen them. But I find it highly unlikely Britain will be competing with anyone for top 100 players, as they said they would be in 5 years' time. And the ones they might have in there will be nothing to do with that system.
The problem is, and this is whenever we get these kind of things, people start leveling criticism at, in inverted commas, the LTA. And that's where I have an issue with. That there are people who work in the performance department of the LTA, specifically the tennis coaches, who are good people. They know what they're doing. They know how to develop players. But they're stifled because we keep doing things like... What we keep doing is we have this idea of employing people in director of performance roles, or whatever they call it, who are not from tennis, and to be honest, they're charlatans. Simon Timpson was a charlatan. He didn't, right from the very off, from every single time I heard him speak, I thought, this guy's a bluffer. And somebody told me right from the start, he will do that job for about 2 years, and then he'll try and get something bigger, because that's what he does. And that's what happened. He moved on. The other thing, we had people in there from cycling and everything else. Tennis is a unique sport, and I don't want to sound like, that we shouldn't look at outside influences, but you've got to have people who know how tennis works in this country. You have good coaches running things. There are good people there, 100% at the LTA. The other thing that we'll do, and this is always the other big bluff that we have, and I'm certain they'll start doing this, probably around Wimbledon, because it always comes. They'll go, we're going to focus on participation, which means nothing, and it's just a get out, and it's just a nonsense. We're going to focus on participation, and that's what we need. We need grassroots tennis and all that kind of thing. It's nonsense. You need to get players. You need to get the good players with good coaches. That's how you develop players, not participation or saying we're going to run schemes where we're going to give 400 new rackets to players and that kind of thing, which always looks good. And then they'll stick some billboards up around London, which always happens, and we don't get anything from it. And we need to stop looking at other sports and going, we're going to employ somebody from British conkers to run our national academies.
It's a world-beating scheme, Calvin, in fairness. I mean, the setup at British Conkers is very impressive.
Yeah.
The work they've been doing with Vinegar in the marginal gains department is quite something.
Some have accused them of treading the line too far there, James. It's a bit controversial. Like those running shoes that people have too much of an advantage.
There's people there, look, joking aside, there's the people there. There are people in this country now. There are even people who are working at the LTA who know how to do this thing. They've done it before. Just let them do the work, and let's crack on. Let's just get the good coaches good coaches with good players, and that's been the problem. Like I say, you've been sending players to Sterling, and George is right. No one wanted to go to Sterling, and then when they got there, they had coaches who weren't good enough, and yeah.
I think the one thing we can all agree on is that more paddle will help us get out of this situation.
Yeah.
More paddle.
We'll be
courts.
without a paddle up Schitt's Creek, I think.
I think you George, you might be high. I assume you've been drinking lean. And also, Calvin, you make a point that Mike also makes in his piece in the Mail, where he says, unfortunately and scarcely believably, there remains no one on the main board of the LTA with any experience of elite tennis to properly question the executive. Now, as Calvin says rightly, I don't believe necessarily you need to have been a horse to be a good jockey, but you would think that on the main board you would want at least one person who has been there and done that at least a little bit.
I think, though, if they're going to do that, James, that doesn't necessarily have to have been a former player. Because I think that's where we've gone before. There's nothing wrong with getting coaches who've worked there before. And it might be a former player, but to be honest, the former players who are around at the minute, when I've heard them speak, they don't speak to me compellingly about how to develop tennis players. Whether there are players in elite tennis, why would you not put somebody like on the board? Why would you not? You know it's going to be. It'll be either Rosetsky or Henman. That's what they'll do, because they do that all the time. Why would you not put James Trotman or Mark Hilton on there and do something like that? Those guys, they work with top 100 players. Why would you not get, I don't know, and any of the other coaches who you could
Calvin Betton.
Well,
You'd tell the bloody executive, wouldn't you?
Without blowing trumpets or anything like that, I'd like to think that I know what elite tennis is. And, that there's not enough people who do that. But then you get, like I say, you go and get someone like Tim Henman, and, I'm sure Tim's a nice guy, but he doesn't know about developing tennis players. Just because you've done it yourself doesn't know know how to tell other people how to do it.
And to be fair, I actually, and I don't know Tim really from Adam, but I get the impression he wouldn't pretend that he did either.
I disagree with that.
All right, okay. Yeah, there you go. Interestingly as well, incidentally, Nick Cavaday could not be, or did not want to comment on his stepping down from the Loughborough Academy, but I have a educated guess that you want someone to coach a top 100 player, I think that might be Nick Cavaday in about 3 weeks' time. But we will see exactly where and when he ends up. Moving on to our two last items, because we've gone on quite a long time, actually. It's been fascinating, chaps. As always, I get the best seat in the house for these podcasts. But there are two players I want to talk about. One being Barbora Krejcikova, and the other one being the man who needs no introduction, Calvin's favourite player, Juan Martín del Potro. Just briefly, George, you can give me a brief answer on Barbora Krejcikova. She's done an interview with Courtney Wen, who writes for the WTA website, saying, I don't want to be forgotten, and making her case for being part of the Big Four, because the narrative in women's tennis at the moment is the Big Three is Świątek, Sabalenka, and Rybakina. And Krejcikova said, when I read something on social media, it's about Iga, Arena, and Elena. I'm not really there. What else should I do? How should I prove it again? This week again I'm here, and I'm going to prove it again so that I get into this top three. I want to be mentioned as well. I want to be recognised as well, because I think I deserve it. I've had a lot of success on the tour, and I just don't get the credit. George, just give you my personal opinion. Great. I love it when someone comes out and says, bloody talk about me more. Do you think she deserves it?
I kind of do, yeah. I mean, I've said about her before that she's one of the few players in the last few years who actually has had the kind of mental toughness to kind of back up what she's saying in terms of, she won a slam. She was actually playing good stuff, and then an injury stopped her. That's kind of what it felt like to me. But either side of the injury, she has been very good. So I think she's kind of right from that perspective. I mean, the obvious challenge back will be, well, you've got to be fitter and sustain it over a longer period. But as I said before, she's already, fifth, sixth in the race at the minute. So she's playing a good level this year. This is good news for women's tennis. If she is driven to get back to where she was when she won that French Open title, she played some really good matches with Świątek, and obviously beat her last year, didn't she? In a really impressive win as well. So she's, in that cluster of players who definitely can be a regular top five. Why not go on win another slam? I think And this is just the culture we actually do want in women's tennis. We want them to be able to identify who the three best players in the world are and want to be one of the three best players in the world or the four best players in the world and to have rivalries with each other. So, yeah, I'm encouraged by these comments and I hope she backs it up and we see some good matches between her and the other ones this week.
Unfortunately, Arina Sabalenka totally agrees, and anyone hoping for a bit of backbiting and bitchiness, Arina Sabalenka said, I was thinking the same. Why everyone is saying it's three of us? No, it's four of us. Arina, I would rather you were a bit of a dick about it, but alas, no dice. Very finally, we want to talk briefly about Lucas Pouille, who has done an interview this week with L'Equipe, which is behind a paywall, so you kind of have to piece it together from various rip-off artists if you don't subscribe to L'Equipe, which the chances are you don't. But it's a pretty sad tale, really. He said that he has had serious depression. He was only sleeping an hour a night, sitting up, drinking alone. He said it was impossible to close my eyes. I was all alone with Felix Mantilla, his coach at the time, and I would go back to my room and look at the ceiling. I was sinking into a creepy thing. I stood up with my eyes blown up. Every morning Felix said to me, don't you sleep? And I say, yes, I have allergies, carpet, pollen, grass. I was lying to him. I locked myself in. I didn't tell anyone. I was in a bad phase and I made the decision to say stop. Otherwise I would have ended up in a mental hospital. For my mental health, I had to stop. When you're young, you make money, you take advantage of it. You see priorities when they aren't in reality. Today, I mourned that period. I think the ego plays a very important role. The impatience to return to the highest level. Calvin, he's someone who has played at a very high level. He's also played at a less high level, and he actually mentions hitting his rock bottom, which I'm sure lots of people have, being on a court watched by you.
Yeah. I don't know whether it was that match, but yeah, he mentioned he said his rock bottom was when he was playing a challenger in Great Britain last June, which I imagine was Ilkley, because I don't think he played Nottingham. And Surbiton is in May. So, and yeah, Luke, who I coach, beat him and his partner in doubles that week. And he didn't look overly interested in being there, to be honest, which now is apparent why.
I think you said to me you thought he might hit his partner.
Yeah, his partner was being a dick, if I'm honest, and he wasn't happy with his partner at all. But yeah, I actually had a quick word with him after, yeah, he didn't seem over the moon about being there, but it's a tough situation for him. I mean, he had some injury problems. He could play, and hopefully he still can. I really remember a match when he beat Nadal at the US Open, and he played some fantastic tennis then. I think that was probably 2016.
It was indeed. He beat him 6-1, 2-6, 6-4, 3-6, 7-6, 8-6 in the final set breaker.
Yeah, it was a great match, and I remember thinking then this is a really serious player, and it just never really progressed from there for him. But hopefully he's only 28, or maybe just 29, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
There's plenty of time for him, and he's got the talent.
George, whenever I mention Lucas Pouille, usually in a conversation about who I think the worst, ATP World Tour Finals player is, that's not Jack Sock or something like that, you tend to pipe up in support of him. So I'm sure I'm sure you'll be looking forward to him returning. An Australian Open semi-finalist once upon a time as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's never nice when this sort of thing happens, and it can be a very isolating world, tennis, I think, and it's one of those sports where I remember Tsonga saying, I asked him after a match, he lost at Queen's, do you kind of are you upset by losing? He goes, no, I lose every single week. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Like thinking about my football team, we win some weeks, I feel good. We lose some weeks, it's not so good. But we're not. If we lost every single week as we have done in some seasons,
I was going to say, George is a Villa fan, so that actually has happened.
That has happened, yeah. So it must be pretty difficult. And, when you're not getting even that slight high of winning some matches, he's had some bad losing streaks I've, clocked over the last few years. He is a player who has travelled to lose, basically. So I hope he gets back up there. He's certainly far better than his ranking at the minute. I'm not saying I didn't think he was amazing, but I thought he hit a level that was suitably high for what he had, to be honest. But yeah, I hope he has, as he said himself, found the right sort of priorities in life now, and he's matured and can enjoy his career.
Yeah, and I think much as I joke about his play, I mean, he's proven that he can get results. He's been as high as, I don't think he actually made top 10. I was just trying to check that, but my fingers weren't quick enough, and I was getting entranced by George's romanticism about him. But he made it to number 10 in the world, exactly number 10 in the world, 5 years ago. So he obviously has some talent, and as Calvin says, that win over Nadal will live long in many people's memories. We wish him all the best. Tennis can be a sport that breaks players, and it's never nice to hear when someone reaches rock bottom in Ilkley, although, as I say, I'm sure plenty of people have done so before. That's all we've got time for, even though we've gone on for ages this week, and I hope you've enjoyed the extra minutes. Not for the first time. We've hit the 100-minute mark on my watch anyway. I've been James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. George Bellshaw has been in seat 1, or maybe seat 0, depending on your counting system. Calvin Betton's been on the other side of me, offering his always informed and always opinionated views. Please do leave us a rating or a review if you've enjoyed them. Tell your friends about Tennis Unfiltered, and most importantly, come back next week. I almost forgot. You're getting a postscript on an already very long podcast, but given that I mentioned it several times and then managed to not actually get it into the podcast, I felt we had to come back and just get Calvin's views, because Juan Martín del Potro said in, I think, the Argentinian press this week, "I love tennis. It will never be a problem to pick up a racket and see how I feel. The physical problem and my knee are things I work on every day. I'm going to leave that window open, at least until the US Open. As I said, this is the most special tournament for me. I still have time. I will start training, see how my leg and knee react, and if I can do it or not." Calvin, this man can't retire.
What? Did he actually retire? Because there was some conjecture about that.
He didn't. Like, he said he was going to retire, and then he was like, I think this... It was basically like Murray 2019 all over again.
Yeah.
Like, it was that sort of, I think it'll be my last one. Same thing, but in Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed he's been really active on Instagram in the last week or so. So I thought maybe, is the big man coming back? I really hope, I hope he is. And I hope he is, but I hope if he does that he can play competitively. But also, if anybody deserves, a swan song and a payday, it's him. There's nobody who's had worse luck than him in the last 5-10 years in tennis.
I always say it about those guys.
Don't know.
I think it's a bit like Murray. He's 34 years old, and he sees all these guys he grew up with and used to really battle with still going and fit, and he's like, it's not fair. I deserve another go, and I'm almost certain that's what it is.
I mean, yeah, the injury was so unlucky and so bad. I mean, he'd had so much bad luck with his body anyway, and then finally seemed to have got it in a place where it was manageable, and then he goes and breaks his kneecap on a net post. It's incomprehensible that sort of thing could happen, and just the game's better with him in it, and he's a unique player. There's no more well-liked player around the tour. Yeah, it'd be great if he could. I don't think he'd come and play unless he thought he was competitive, and he'll know if he's competitive. Even when he came back and he played that match and he said he couldn't train, he could barely move or anything, he still looked pretty good in that.
George, in a sentence, how excited are you about Juan Martín del Potro's comeback again?
I'm very excited. I'm not sure I would compare myself to Calvin's love of Del Potro. I mean, I adore him as a player, but just that speaks volumes to Calvin's adoration rather than my views on him. Yeah, I mean, look, he's brilliant. And the thing is with Del Potro, the one thing that will not change is that if he's able to get on the court, he'll still have a forehand that can absolutely smash through anyone on there, and that shot alone could drag you quite a long way. So yeah, if he gets himself in a place where he's fit, can go, I'd still back him to mix it and be a top 50, maybe higher player. Who knows? The sky's the limit with that forehand.
I wonder as well, like, 'cause it's been now a year since he played. I wonder if the wrist healed and he can hit backhands.
Crikey. A forehand and a backhand. Chance to be a fine thing. My personal view on this comeback is I'll believe it when I see
it. Sports Social Podcast Network.